I'd like to begin the course with explaining the outline of our course, our 12-week course. I will begin these first 3 weeks on T.S. Eliot, and then Joseph Pierce will be here to speak 3 weeks on the writer, the novelist Evelyn Waugh, and then I'll be back to do 3 weeks on C.S. Lewis, and then Joseph back for the last 3 weeks on Tolkien. So we hope that you'll be able to benefit and learn from these courses, and that your faith will be strengthened, as well as learning more about Catholic and Christian culture. We call them Christian writers because, of course, 2 of them remained Anglicans, members of the Church of England. And I'll explain how we categorize Lewis and Eliot as Catholic writers, even though they did not come into the Catholic Church formally. And that should become clear as we go. What I'd like to discuss with to begin about T.S. Eliot is to outline a little bit of what these 3 weeks will actually consist of. Eliot's life and work can very easily be broken down into 3 segments, which will be the 3 weeks that we'll cover this week, next week, and the week after. Those 3 segments can also, if you like, be seen to be a kind of parallel to Dante's great trilogy, the Divine Comedy, which, as you know, is split into the Inferno, hell, the Purgatorio, purgatory, and Paradiso, heaven. And so Eliot's work as well, his life and work, can also be split into 3, which can be seen to be symbolic or run parallel to hell, purgatory, and heaven. In each of the 3 sessions on Eliot, I'll be dealing with his biography, his life history, how that affected the work that he produced, and also be looking at some of his poetry and explaining how these actually fit together. And in this first session this evening, therefore, we'll be dealing with his early years and that which runs parallel to the Inferno or Dante's hell. You may come away from it thinking, this guy's a Christian writer, he's a Catholic writer, because he's going to be dealing with some pretty dark stuff. But that's what hell is about, right? Okay, so we're going to be talking about that and seeing how it parallels Eliot's vision of hell, and also looking at his biography, some of the hell that he went through as a person, and how he writes from his experience. Now, this is paradoxical or ironic because Eliot was very clear in his literary criticism that you should not actually judge or interpret an artist's work according to his life. And yet when we look at Eliot's work, we'll see that actually it's almost impossible to understand his work without understanding his life. Because his work is, like every artist, his work is deeply influenced by his personal experience. And Eliot's personal experience is profound, it's dramatic, and it directly influences his art and his poetry. But before we get there, I'd like to actually share a personal experience of my own. If you've read my autobiography, which came out last year, there's a detail in there which I sort of make light of, and that is what happened to me when I was 9 years old. We didn't have a TV in our home, and so therefore we read a lot, at least I did. My parents made sure that we had those World Book encyclopedias. Remember the green and white World Book encyclopedias? We had the whole set of them there. And every year we would get the annual as well, which sort of went through the year's events and chronicled them. And I was 9 years old in 1965 when T.S. Eliot died. So that led me to a lifelong interest in T.S. Eliot, and I'm excited to be able to share some of that with you here this evening and over the next couple of weeks. And I can remember as a 9-year-old reading T.S. Eliot's obituary in the World Book annual for that year and being intrigued by him. He had gone to England from his home in St. Louis, Missouri, and became a poet. And there he was with his sad face in his obituary with his 3-piece suit, looking quite serious and sober. And I thought, you could do that. You could go to England and become a writer. How amazing would that be? So that was my introduction to T.S. Eliot, and I've been intrigued by him ever since. And of course, I did actually go to England, and I wore 3-piece suits too. Eliot was born in 1888 in St. Louis, Missouri. And it's always important to understand a family background for anybody. And his family background was what they call a Boston Brahmin family. The Boston Brahmins are the Boston aristocrats, the people who came over, whose ancestors came over on the Mayflower. They were the ones who started Princeton and Yale and Harvard. These were the ones who were the blue bloods, the ones who, if America had an aristocracy, they were the aristocracy. Eliot's grandfather was named had the wonderful New England name of William Greenleaf Eliot. And William Greenleaf Eliot left the Boston area where the family had settled and moved to St. Louis, Missouri in the mid-1800s to start a Unitarian church. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Unitarians were an offspring of the Puritans who founded New England, and they had been influenced by the Transcendentalists, the philosophers from that time period in the late 1700s and early 1800s, who basically steered traditional historical Christianity away from miracles and away from the incarnation and away from all that Catholic stuff, and steered it over to a much more acceptable, respectable kind of religion, which was all about being a respectable citizen, having high moral standards, accepting the beautiful teachings of our Lord Jesus Christ, but rejecting all the supernatural stuff. And the Unitarians, therefore, were called Unitarians because one of the things they rejected was the doctrine of the Holy Trinity. They were one step on from the other philosophers in the beginning of the USA who believed there was a God out there who created the world but really didn't do anything after that. The Unitarians, therefore, didn't believe in the Trinity, they didn't believe in the virgin birth, they didn't believe in the incarnation, but they were good people. And they believed in creating a good moral society. And they saw this also, because they were very patriotic, as one of the ways of, when America was still surging forward and growing, of helping to develop a good, responsible, respectable citizenry who accepted the ideals and the moral teachings of Jesus, but rejected all that supernatural stuff. So Eliot's grandfather was a Unitarian minister, actually a Unitarian church planter, because he went to Missouri to actually start a Unitarian congregation. Eliot's father, Henry Ware Eliot, was a successful businessman in St. Louis. He ran a brick manufacturing company. Eliot's mother, Charlotte Stearns, which is where we get Eliot's middle name. He was called Thomas Stearns Eliot, T.S. Eliot. Charlotte Stearns was a minor poet and a social worker, very much a respectable middle-class, upper-middle-class lady who was concerned with helping the poor and being the kind of woman that you would expect from the Unitarian philosophy. A cultured lady, a well-spoken lady, an articulate lady, and also a do-gooder. Eliot was the youngest of 4 or 5 children. All the rest were sisters, and he was a sickly child who wasn't able to get out and play very much, so he read a lot of books. He always had his nose stuck in a book, and he says that his youth and childhood growing up in St. Louis was one of the major influences on him. He writes, and we'll see later, about the influence of the river, the Mississippi, which is running right through St. Louis. If you visit St. Louis today, you want to go to the cathedral, which is one of the greatest cathedrals in America, one of the most beautiful cathedrals in America, and just 2 blocks behind the cathedral, you can see the home where T.S. Eliot grew up. It's still there. He grew up right there in Old St. Louis. The family still had their links back to their extended family in Boston, where one of Eliot's other ancestors was actually a president of Harvard University. So they had close links with Harvard. Eliot, after going to various private schools and getting a classical education, enrolled in Harvard as a young teenager. And he goes to Harvard and completes his Harvard degree in 3 years. By 1909, Eliot did something quite daring. We know from his biographers that when he was an undergraduate in Harvard, he would take time to wander through the streets of Boston. The streets of Boston, of course, it was a big bustling city, and he took himself away from the respectable confines of Harvard with all its respectable intellectual people, mostly who were Unitarians and nice, good people, and went and wandered through the slum streets of Boston, picking up some of the nightlife and being intrigued by the sort of seamier side of life. In 1909, he did something pretty daring. He went to Paris. Now remember, at this time, in this environment in early 20th century New England, where everybody was very staid and very formal and very respectable, Paris was the city of sin. And to actually go to Paris, France, was a big, risky thing for a young man to do. So therefore, in his late teens, early 20s, he actually goes to Paris and he begins to study at the Sorbonne University, and he studies philosophy and poetry. And we know from his letters and from his diary that he kept that when he was in Paris, he also used to take time at night and wander through the city streets. And he would take himself into some of the more seamier sides of Paris because he was intrigued by the nightlife, he was intrigued by the low life, he was intrigued by that whole aspect of Paris. We don't know whether he misbehaved in Paris or not, because he was very private with his life. And we don't know whether as a young man he actually indulged in some of the pleasures of Paris, but we could guess that the temptations were there. In 1911, he returns to Harvard to do some graduate work. And while he's in Harvard in 1911, between 1911 and 1914, he falls in love with a woman named Emily Hale, who will come back, and we'll see her returning in his life time and again. Emily Hale would have been for T.S. Eliot the perfect wife. She was pretty, she was intelligent, she was a drama major, and in fact, he and Emily Hale in those years actually performed together in a stage adaptation of a Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. I believe it's, I forget which part Emily played, but I know that T.S. Eliot played the part of Mr. Bennet. And he fell in love with Emily Hale. And Emily Hale was not only pretty and intelligent, but she came from a good Boston family. By this time, Eliot was preparing to do a PhD in philosophy at Harvard, and it was all lined up for him to have a career as a college professor of philosophy at Harvard by 1914. He would have had his college career at Harvard, he would have had his perfect Harvard wife in Emily Hale, and everything was all set up. But he decided instead to take up a scholarship to study in Europe. So he goes back across the Atlantic in 1914, first of all to study in Germany at Marburg. But what happens in 1914 in Europe? War breaks out, okay? War with Germany. So he leaves Germany and he winds up in Oxford. And he writes to his friend Conrad Aiken, who's another poet who was actually at Harvard with T.S. Eliot and was a friend of T.S. Eliot. And he writes to Conrad Aiken and he says, "University life is the same everywhere." He says, "There are smug professors with their smug wives and their children, and it's all very boring." He's a young man in his early 20s, and he's saying life at Oxford, he was getting lined up for professorship in the premier university of the world, Oxford University. And he writes to his friend and says, "Ho-hum, it's as boring here as it was in Harvard." And he therefore steps away from Oxford, and he's spending a lot of time in London with the emerging radical literary set. And he makes friends with Ezra Pound, and before long he makes friends with Virginia Woolf and with the other leaders of the literary set in London. Ezra Pound, who's an American who's living over in England himself, adopts T.S. Eliot. Not formally, legally, but he adopts him as his mentor, and he begins to pick up Eliot's poetry and to promote Eliot. So Eliot, therefore, in 1914 is in Oxford, and in 1915 he leaves Oxford and he takes a radical step. The radical step is that he marries, without knowing her very long at all, a dancer. Her name is Vivian Haywood. She's flighty, she's fun, she's dramatic, but she's also emotionally and mentally unstable. Now here's Eliot, imagine this. Here's Eliot, who comes from this buttoned up, respectable Boston family, Unitarians who are respectable and never do anything daring and never do anything risky. First of all, he goes to Paris, then he comes back, he tests the water about whether he wants to be a college professor or not, and by this time he had completed his PhD thesis in the philosophy of Bradley. He then goes back to England and says, that PhD, meh. He doesn't come back to defend his thesis. In other words, he doesn't care about the PhD. He doesn't pick it up. Instead, he marries Vivian, a dancer, with no prospects, no financial prospects, and he has to support his wife away from his family while Europe is engaging in the First World War, living in a dreary, smoke-ridden, cold London. And this is going to help to form some of his poetry, as we see. Take a look at his famous breakout poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. This poem was written when he was 22, just after he came back from Paris, and he was in Harvard again, and he's in love with Emily Hale, is when he writes The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. The opening epilogue is from Dante's Inferno. And Eliot said later that Dante was the greatest poetic influence on him. In fact, he learned Italian specially so he could read Dante's Divine Comedy. The translation is, "If I thought that my reply would be to someone who would ever return to earth, this flame would remain without further movement. But as no one has ever returned alive from this gulf, if what I hear is true, I can answer you with no fear of infamy." So what I'd like to do is actually go through the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock with you, and you can see from what I've told you about Eliot's biography how this helps you to understand the poem. His famous opening line, "Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table." What's etherized? Knocked out, anesthetized, okay? And this striking image at the very beginning of the poem is actually kind of a symbol for the entire poem. Here is a man who's lying on a table, etherized, anesthetized. Why is that? Why is a person going to be anesthetized on a table? Because they're going to operate on him, right? And so the whole thing is an exercise in a man who's paralyzed and realizes that he's going to be operated on, okay? Not physically, but he's actually going to be operated on mentally and spiritually. He's going to be dissected, if you like. So this is how Eliot, at the age of 22, is feeling. He's paralyzed by life. You remember that strict upbringing he had? He feels like he's in a straitjacket. He's paralyzed, he's lying on a table, and someone's going to dissect him. He's going to dissect himself and pick himself apart and actually analyze himself. Why is he feeling this way? Then he says, "Let us go through certain half-deserted streets, the muttering retreats of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels, and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells. Streets that follow like a tedious argument of insidious intent, to lead you to an overwhelming question, 'Oh, do not ask what is it, let us go and make our visit.'" He's remembering wandering through those streets of Boston, wandering through those seamy streets of Paris, wandering through the seamy streets of London, and he's thinking, my life in Boston, with all of its strict upbringing and its little rules and regulations and its respectability and its nice people, is that really what I want? What about those other streets I wandered around with, those working class people, those poor people, those homeless people, those unemployed people, those women and those men in their one-night cheap hotels and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells? What's a one-night cheap hotel? Economy Inn, okay? It's a hotel where you only stay for one night or 1 hour because you're up to no good, okay? So he's aware of that seamy side of life, and he says, let us go and make our visit. He's going to be going, remember he's back in Boston now when he's writing this, okay, with all the respectable people in Harvard, and he's going to go and make a visit. Where is he going to go? He's going to go to one of their respectable soirees, one of the respectable evening gatherings where they're gathering together to discuss literature and art and culture and all the fine philosophical things. That's why he says, in the room the women come and go, doing what? Talking of Michelangelo and talking of all the other wonderful Italian artists and talking about art and music and all the finer things. Then he jumps back, and this would be typical of Eliot's poetry, which makes it so difficult for people. He jumps around from place to place and vision to vision, scene to scene. Now he's talking again about being back in the streets. The yellow fog that rubs its back upon the window panes, the yellow smoke that rubs its muzzle on the window panes, licked its tongue into the corners of the evening, lingered upon the pools that stand in drains, let fall upon its back the soot that falls from chimneys, slipped by the terrace, made a sudden leap, and seeing that it was a soft October night, curled once about the house and fell asleep. You might remember from your school days that poem by Carl Sandburg called The Fog. Eliot uses a similar image. And indeed there will be time for the yellow smoke that slides along the street, rubbing its back upon the window panes. There will be time to prepare a face, to meet the faces that you meet. There will be time to murder and create. That sounds pretty grim. What does he mean that there will be a time to prepare a face to meet the faces that you meet? Well, ladies, if you're going out to an evening event or a party, do you put on your face? Isn't that a slang for putting on your makeup? Okay. He's saying we all need to prepare our face for the faces we will meet. We need to prepare our outward image. We need to prepare our outward facade so that when we go to this cultured party, we're going to fit in. We're going to say the right things to the right people. See what I mean? And then he goes on and says something rather grim about this social activity. There will be time to prepare a face, to meet the faces that you meet. There will be a time to murder and create. Who's being murdered? The real person, to create the artificial face, okay? To go out to this party, to go out to this soiree, to go out to this meeting with cultured, respectable people. Let's jump forward. And again, he has this refrain, in the room the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. Now, he's at the home where this event is taking place. And maybe he's upstairs getting himself ready. He says, and indeed there will be time to wonder, do I dare and do I dare? Time to turn back and descend the stair with a bald spot in the middle of my hair. They will say, how his hair is growing thin. My morning coat, my collar mounting firmly to the chin, my necktie rich and modest, but asserted by a simple pin. They will say, but how his arms and legs are thin. Do I dare disturb the universe? In a minute there is time for decisions and revisions, which a minute will reverse. What's he thinking as he's getting ready? He's got his outfit all set, his coat is fine, his tie is good, he's got the simple tie pin. He's going to go downstairs now to the party, and he's thinking, they're going to see the bald spot. I'm already balding. I'm only in my 20s. I'm already balding. They're going to comment, aren't his legs thin? They're going to comment on his appearance, right? And he's asking himself, do I dare? Do I dare? Do I dare to do what? Do I dare to break the mold and leave this respectable, boring world I'm in? He's in his early 20s, remember. He's contemplating a big decision. Will he leave Harvard and his respectable, artificial, fake, religious, respectable world and take this daring leap to go back across the Atlantic and seek his fortune? And he says, for I have known them all already, known them all, have known the evenings, mornings, afternoons. I have measured out my life with coffee spoons. I know the voices dying with a dying fall beneath the music from a farther room, so how should I presume? In other words, I know this world, and I'm already bored by it. That fantastic image, I have measured out my life in coffee spoons. One endless round of tea parties with dull people. And I have known the eyes already, known them all. By the way, if you go online, you can hear T.S. Eliot reading his poetry. They've got it all recorded, and you can find it online. Just type in T.S. Eliot reading J. Alfred Prufrock. He's got this kind of Anglo-American accent, which is kind of a little bit nasal, and he reads it like this. This sounds what it sounds like. He says, and I have known the eyes already, known them all. The eyes that fix you in a formulated phrase. And when I am formulated, sprawling on a pin, when I am pinned and wriggling on the wall, then how should I begin to spit out all the butt ends of my days and ways, and how should I presume? In other words, he's seeing himself as being analyzed, like an insect in an insect collection. They're going to take him and they're going to pin him up in their little world as an exhibit. Is he happy about that? But there's a lady there, okay? And remember, this is the time period in his life when he's back in Harvard and he's fallen in love with Emily Hale, this perfect wife. And I have known the arms already, known them all, arms that are braceleted and white and bare, but in the lamplight downed with light brown hair. Is it perfume from a dress that makes me so digress? So now he's looking over at this lovely lady, probably Emily Hale. Arms that lie along a table or wrap around a shawl, and should I then presume, and how should I begin? Does he dare to ask her to marry him or to ask her out? He's a timid young man, bottled up with his puritanical upbringing, worried about his sexuality. And he wonders, can he talk to her about what he's done in Paris, what he's done in London? And shall I say, I have gone at dusk through narrow streets and watched the smoke that rises from the pipes of lonely men in shirt sleeves leaning out of windows? I should have been a pair of ragged claws scuttling across the floors of silent seas. What does that mean? Okay, with this little couplet, I should have seen a pair of ragged claws scuttling across the floors of silent seas. I want to introduce you to one of the keys to the puzzling poetry of T.S. Eliot, okay? Because his poetry is a puzzle, okay? It's difficult to understand what he's getting at. And very often, and we'll see this in The Wasteland, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, he will use images he'll pop them into the poetry out of nowhere, and this image is just given to you. This is because he was very influenced by the French symbolist poets, Laforgue and various others. When he was in Paris, he actually studied with some of them. And they had a fantastic theory of poetry which was unique to their particular French poetry, this symbolist poetry, with an O, symbolist poetry. And that is, they had it was kind of like Impressionism in painting, that a particular image would be given to you, and you weren't supposed to ask so much what the image meant, you were to ask yourself how the image made you feel. And this is a good example of it. I should have been a pair of ragged claws scuttling across the floors of silent seas. Somebody's giving me a gesture of how it makes him feel. That's what Eliot wants you to do. He wants you to have an emotional impression from the image. It's kind of like linguistic impressionism, okay? When you look at an impressionistic picture, for instance, you're not so much supposed to say, well, what is it? You're supposed to say, how does it make me feel? And Eliot's using the same trick here in his poetry. And in The Wasteland, he will use it over and over again. He actually devised a literary term for this. It's called the objective correlative. The objective correlative. Correlative meaning a link or a connection. And the objective correlative is the objective thing, in this case, a crab, a pair of ragged claws, scuttling across the floors of silent seas. And that objective thing is meant to unlock an emotion in the reader. Now, the curious and interesting thing to me is, actually, it may unlock different emotions in different readers, depending on your own personal circumstances and your own personal life experience. If you're a crab fisherman, it might mean something very different to you than most people when you hear about claws scuttling across a silent sea. Here's what Eliot said about this. He said, I'm rather inclined to believe for myself that my best poems are possibly those which evoke the greatest number and variety of interpretations, surprising to myself. Now, this is one of the interesting things about art, all kinds of art, is that the artist, the poet, the filmmaker, the novelist, may very well devise an image or an idea or a character or a scene in order to communicate something which he or she wants to communicate, but the person in the audience or the reader actually sees something completely different in it. And the good artist says, I can remember an interview, for instance, with the filmmaker Steven Spielberg, and he was having a question and answer with an audience after his film Saving Private Ryan, which is a wonderful film. One of the people in the groups asked him a question and said, Mr. Spielberg, in the cemetery scene where you have a close-up of the crosses in the military cemetery, and you then bring the camera up to look at the hero, were you trying to make us feel that he's a Christ figure? And Spielberg, who's a Jew, said something similar to what T.S. Eliot just said right there. He said, you know, one of the things I find most interesting about my films, he says, is what people see in them that I never intended, which is the same sort of idea. And so Eliot throws these images out there in order to evoke an emotion. And a lot of times the emotions he's trying to evoke are actually the emotions that he's feeling, and he's successful with that. But these claws scuttling across the floors of silent seas are trying to make you feel his feelings at that time of being, okay, under the water, scuttling along, trying to get away from some predator perhaps. And then he bounces back. If you go down to the next paragraph, and the afternoon, the evening, sleep so peacefully, smoothed by long fingers, asleep, tired, or it malingers. Stretched on the floor here beside you and me. Is he stretched out on the floor next to Emily? Next to the young lady with the lovely arms and the shawl? Should I, after tea and cakes and ices, have the strength to force the moment to its crisis? Might he actually kiss her? But though I have wept and fasted, wept and prayed, though I have seen my head grown slightly bald, brought in upon a platter, I am no prophet, and there's no great matter. I have seen the moment of my greatness flicker, and I have seen the eternal footman hold my coat and snicker. And in short, I was afraid. Here's this young man who's actually facing a little crisis in his life. Is he going to leave respectable Boston and go back across the ocean to Paris and to London and to Europe? Or is he actually going to stay there and take the moment to its crisis and actually do something about Emily Hale? And he comes back into self-examination again. And would it have been worth it after all, after the cups, the marmalade, the tea, among the porcelain, among some talk of you and me, would it have been worthwhile to have bitten off the matter with a smile, to have squeezed the universe into a ball, to roll it towards some overwhelming question, to say, I am Lazarus, come from the dead, come back to tell you all, I shall tell you all, if one, settling a pillow by her head, should say, that is not what I meant at all. No, that is not it at all. Again, his whole experience it's a big question for him. It's like a universal question. And does he have the strength, and can he dare to do this? And again, he questions that whole sort of safe environment. Would it have been worth it after all, after the sunsets and the dooryards and the sprinkled streets, after the novels, after the teacups, after the skirts that trail along the floor, and this and so much more? It is impossible to say what I mean. Here's a little vignette of life in Boston at the beginning of the 20th century. The sunsets and the dooryards. The dooryards are a front yard. What's the sprinkled streets? A lot of the streets are dirt streets, and in the summer or in the warm weather, to calm all the dust, they go through and they sprinkle the streets with water, just a little bit just to calm the dust down. After the novels, after the teacups and the skirts that trail along the floor, the women are wearing floor-length dresses at this point, okay, with high collars, okay? That's the way the women are dressed, in that same puritanical way. And moving to the end, but as if a magic lantern threw the nerves and patterns on a screen, would it have been worthwhile if one, settling on a pillow or throwing off a shawl and turning toward the window, should say, that is not it at all, that is not what I meant at all? This is obviously the respectable lady, maybe even Emily Hale, sort of tossing it off like, you weren't really listening to me. And he comes back to who he really feels he is. I am not Prince Hamlet, nor was meant to be. I'm an attendant lord, one that will do to swell a progress, start a scene or two, advise the prince, no doubt an easy tool, deferential, glad to be of use, poetic, cautious and meticulous, politic, cautious and meticulous, full of high sentence but a bit obtuse, at times indeed almost ridiculous, almost at times the fool. That's how he sees himself. He's not a daring person. He can't actually do this. In fact, he's prematurely old. I grow old, I shall wear the bottoms of my trousers rolled. He's 22. That's how he feels. Shall I part my hair behind? Do I dare to eat a peach? I shall wear the white flannel trousers and walk upon the beach. I have heard the mermaids singing each to each. Remember, the mermaids are also sirens in classical literature, the seducing women. Do I dare to eat a peach? What a line for South Carolinians. When I lived in England, this line came home to me because I went out on a picnic with some English people, and they had the basket, and it was all there. And the father, I will never forget, reached into the basket and said, I've got a special treat for us today. It's a peach. And while we take peaches for granted in the summertime, peaches in England are quite rare, okay? And peaches in England are a little bit of a luxury. So Eliot is saying, and I expect in Boston in the beginning of the 20th century, peaches were a bit of a luxury as well. So again, do I dare to eat a peach? Do I dare to walk upon the beach and even roll my trousers up and do something daring like that? I've heard the mermaids singing each to each. In other words, I've heard the seductions of the beautiful women. I do not think that they will sing to me. I have seen them riding seaward on the waves. And he ends with a beautiful bit of poetry here. I have seen them riding seaward on the waves, combing the white hair of the waves blown back. When the wind blows the water white and black. We have lingered in the chambers of the sea, by sea girls wreathed with seaweed red and brown, till human voices wake us, and we drown. How did you feel about that poem? Sad? Is he one mixed up kid? Yeah, absolutely, okay? He's got all sorts of turmoil going on inside him, okay? And he's trying to decide what he's going to do with his life. Is he actually going to go back across the Atlantic? Is he actually going to take this daring step? We actually discover that he did go back across the Atlantic. He forsook his PhD. He forsook Emily Hale. He forsook his college career. And he went back to London, penniless, separated by the Atlantic from his family. And he marries Vivian. Okay, we're going to pick it up there next week, okay? Because the story and the drama of the story becomes much more interesting with his relationship with Vivian. And we will actually next week move into the time of his life when he becomes a Christian, and he is baptized and leaves his Unitarianism, and his poetry begins to shift over to actually become Christian poetry. Now, to do this, to prepare for next week, I would actually ask you to try to read The Wasteland, his really great poem from this same time period. And we'll discuss it a little bit, but we don't have time to go into the whole thing because it's a very complex and very long poem. However, when you read The Wasteland, if you were somewhat confused by the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, when you read The Wasteland, you will really be confused. But I'm going to give you a hint. I found a fantastic website. This all runs together here. After the pound sign is epigraph. Now, this website has got the entire Wasteland available for you, free of charge. Furthermore, all the tricky stuff, there's lots of little foreign language quotes within it. There's lots of obscure references. You use your mouse and you bring the cursor over that part of the poem, and a little window pops up to give you the translation into English, to also give you all of the obscure references and what it actually means. So, for instance, there's a line in The Wasteland which says, "Ooh, that elegant Shakespearean rag." And you're saying, what? So you move your cursor over it, and a window pops up telling you that this is actually the quote from a ragtime song which was popular in London in the 1920s. Okay? And likewise, it'll give you all the references to the classical literature, to the Hinduism and the Buddhism which is in the poem. So if you want to have The Wasteland and really understand it, that will help you. If you don't actually get around to reading The Wasteland, because it is pretty hard work, then what I would like you to do most of all is to read Ash Wednesday. Okay? This is Eliot's poem from his middle section of his life, which is actually the most important one. And it's not as obscure and difficult as his other poetry. So if you want to read The Wasteland, this is absolutely vital. But I will ask you to read the Ash Wednesday for next week. And again, if you don't have Eliot's poems in a book form, and this is the one I've had since college, T.S. Eliot Poems and Plays. All these poems are online, okay? So if you Google Ash Wednesday, it'll pop up on your screen and you can read it online, okay? I'm going to put these in a list for you, but the best biography of Eliot is T.S. Eliot, An Imperfect Life by Lyndall Gordon, and I'll make a list of these for you next week, okay? Some of the key books if you want to read further on Eliot. Eliot's poetry, right from the beginning, was difficult to get published. Okay, publishers don't publish much poetry anyway because nobody buys it. Okay, so it was difficult to get published, and when it was published, the critical reviews of Prufrock were pretty scathing. It was revolutionary, it was radical stuff, okay? If you think of art from the same time period and music, Eliot's poetry was the equivalent of Picasso, you know, with all the jagged shapes and the cubism and stuff and everything being broken up into different fractured pieces. His poetry has rhyme and meter within it, and he was also very good at using the rhythms of natural speech. So although it's not dum-de-dum-de-dum-de-boo, dum-de-dum-de-dum-de-shoo, dum-de-dum-de-dum-de-hoo, that kind of poetry, it's got that kind of rhythm and that kind of rhyme within it. And you can see that in Prufrock when you read through it again. But it's fractured and it's split up into lots of different pieces. And that's the other clue to reading his poetry. The first is the objective correlative. See the images and let them ask yourself how it makes you feel. And the second is that you'll be confronted with lots of different images from different sources from all over the place. And the best thing to do is to sort of just wade through, use clues like this to try to figure it out if you can. But if you don't actually understand all the references to Greek philosophy and Hindu religion and all the rest of the arcane and intellectual references, it's okay. You're reading it to sort of also get how it makes you feel. He's actually a very introverted, very introspective man who's very, very private. Okay, so that will come out in poetry time and time again. When we get into his Christian aspect, we will see that this actually helps him to become a very meditative, contemplative person. But he's also universalizing his experience. So although he's introspective and asking himself questions, in Prufrock he says, do I dare to ask the universal question? the big question, which is the question of salvation. We know from his biographers like Lyndall Gordon, she did a fantastic job of researching his life. She went back, for instance, and to the card catalogs of the books that were borrowed from Harvard University Library when he was there, and she discovered all the books he was reading when he was an undergraduate. And they were books on the psychology of religion, the mysticism of the Eastern religions, the mysticism of medieval Christianity. He was interested in the meditative and contemplative life right from these early days. Lewis died in 1963. Lewis died the afternoon that JFK was assassinated.